Right here we have the RX 7900 XTX, and this is connected directly to a power supply metering unit that tells us how much wattage the GPU alone is using, besides any other parts on the test bench. And what I've been finding curious is there's reports out there that these graphics cards, the 7900 XTX, uses actually quite a bit of power consumption when you've got different monitors hooked up, especially on idle power consumption. So we're going to run a few tests here today with this card versus, say, the 6800 XT, as well as the RTX 4080. And what I've found here is something actually quite bizarre already. And this is with an Asus 360 Hertz monitor. When this is set to 240 Hertz, the power consumption here of the GPU on idle is around 17 to 18 watts. It's actually really low. It's even lower than that in the testing that I did before on the RTX 4080 and 4090. But this is the weird thing. When we turn this to 360 Hertz, the power consumption goes all the way up to 50 watts on idle. So the reports that you heard about some weird behavior on this GPU are indeed correct. And now I actually don't know exactly why this is, but I want to quickly take some time out here today to test a few more GPUs and see if this is something that's happening on other AMD cards or on the NVIDIA cards, especially at 360 Hertz. Because in the previous video, I did all my testing on a 4K OLED, and that was absolutely fine with the 7900 XTX. So without further ado, let's get some more numbers for you guys. Today's video is brought to you by ASRock and their monster X670E Taichi motherboard. This has a 27-phase VRM capable of not just powering the latest Ryzen 7000 series CPUs, but possibly even your house, and supporting DDR5 memory overclocks over 4 DIMMs up to 6600 MHz and a blazing fast M.2 PCIe Gen 5 X4 slot. This is designed to give you it all. Links in the description below to find out more. And we have now finished the 7900 XTX testing as well as the RX 6800 XT testing. Now, I've jotted down some results which in ways are pretty concerning for the 7900 XTX. The first one being that the idle power consumption, I really could only replicate this at 360 Hertz, and on the same monitor at 240 Hertz, it doesn't do it. So when we move it over to the 6800 XT, that idling power consumption wasn't a problem. So it is unique to either the hardware or the software, the driver implementation on the 7900 XTX. And I think AMD should fix that in time or very quickly. That shouldn't be a problem, or at least I hope. But then we move over to more concerning matters with the GPU, and that is with the efficiency claims that AMD made with the 7900 XTX, especially versus their predecessor cards. And that mainly has to do with the 54% efficiency increase that they promised. Now, with the 6800 XT in particular, I was able to undervolt this card quite well. It actually went down to my undervolt figures here, where we did a Firestrike Ultra at 4K test, and the GPU direct temperature there was going down to around 220 to 230 watts. Which, when we tried to undervolt the 7900 XTX, that could only go down from the wall around 50 watts. And in fact, undervolting and also overclocking is so bizarre on this card, where you can't really change the frequency sliders, you cannot change the voltage settings. Well, you can, it's just that it does nothing. There's no effect. And the only way really you're getting overclocks out of this card is by upping the memory slider and increasing the memory frequency, as well as increasing the power target, or in the case of undervolting, decreasing the power target. So I thought this was very bizarre behavior, and I hope AMD, again, just like the idling issue, fixes this issue with a driver update very quickly, because I'd really like to see more than just 50 watts, or in this case, not even 50 watts savings from the wall when we're gaming. And so that's all it has to offer in terms of undervolting. for me, that's actually the biggest deal breaker, because every other card that's been released in the RX 6000 series and even the RTX 4000 series, it undervolts extremely well. And that's where, if we're comparing undervolted figures versus undervolted figures, that 54% efficiency jargon that they said in the presentation, that completely goes out the window. Though, I mean, at stock settings, it kind of is relevant. There is a big power efficiency gain there. But if you're a tech enthusiast and you really want to know the true numbers of the silicon, I would say it's more appropriate to compare undervolted figures versus undervolted figures, since we're talking about saving power. Though, all that aside, the card overclocked actually decently when you up the power targets. However, that said, I couldn't up the power target to 115% because the whole system would just switch off. And so maybe, and that's with 100% fan speeds too. So maybe that's a limit of just 2 PCIe 8-pin power connectors. And so the aftermarket cards may fix that issue. But in terms of this card right here, 10% power target roughly, as well as about 8% on the frequency, and the memory did give us a decent sizable overclock that wasn't too power inefficient. It was actually pretty decent. So overclocking this thing out of the box is actually, compared to undervolting, the better option to do. Now, in terms of the 6800 XT, that performed quite well. That did its job. I mean, there's nothing really to fault about the RX 6000 series cards. They're great value. They perform really well when you undervolt them. However, that said, we're now going to move over to the RX 4000 series so we can finalize the graphs and get you guys the verdict on the 7900 XTX versus the RTX 4080 for power consumption. And after finishing up testing on the RTX 4000 series, can finally present to you guys some graphs simply showing the 7900 XTX is okay, but it's certainly not what AMD promised in their original presentation. The up to 54% power efficiency, even versus say a 6800 XT, is just not there, especially when we undervolt the 6800 XT. In fact, the power consumption or the efficiency is very similar for the synthetic point per watt, if that makes any sense, as the 6000 series versus the 7000 series, because you simply can't really undervolt the new RX 7900 XTX. It doesn't undervolt that well at all. There was someone who loves undervolting and getting the most power efficiency out of my graphics cards. This is where the RX 7900 XTX actually starts to do quite poorly compared to its main competitor, the RTX 4080. And I'll show you guys some graphs here, both with the Firestrike 4K Ultra benchmarks, which is pure rasterization, where the RTX 4080 does respond much better in terms of its undervolting, but also out of the box does carry better power efficiency. And the surprising thing here was the RX 6800 XT undervolts very well too. And this is what we were saying before earlier in this video. The RX 6000 series was a really good step for AMD, which they showcased how good they can be in the graphics card department. But the 7900 XTX, it remains to be seen if this card is going to benefit a lot more from drivers when these sort of numbers are locked with power targets going to minus 10% and then plus 10% for your overclocks, and changing voltage settings and frequencies isn't really doing much in terms of power delivery. So I was surprised to see that. I hope AMD can work on this and get this thing working as best as it can be. Then we can come back and revisit the numbers, because as it stands, the RTX 4080 is running laps around the 7900 XTX in terms of its power efficiency numbers. But also what I decided to do here was boot up Apex Legends and run this at 360 Hertz as well as 240 Hertz with the display's refresh rate, just to see if those idle power consumption numbers were having any effect when the card was on max 300 FPS in this game, which is the hard limit for Apex Legends. And the good news here for the 7900 XTX was it had the same power draw at 240 Hertz versus 360 Hertz in this game. However, the bad news is that the RTX 4080 at that same 300 FPS performed much better both out of the box and undervolted. And also the overclocking figures were reasonably good on both, although I'm not a big enthusiast of overclocking nowadays, So even though I include it in the benchmarks, I tend not to emphasize it or focus on it a whole lot, as I believe these cards, both coming out of NVIDIA and AMD, are pushed above their efficiency peak. However, going back to the RTX 4080 idle power consumption numbers, they were very similar to the 7900 XTX. However, they did work properly with 360 Hz. So I'd say the idle power consumption should be fixed with a driver update very soon for the 7900 XTX. I don't know why this bizarre behavior of setting your monitor to 360 Hz. I mean, only that resolution at 300 Hz or 240 Hz, it doesn't raise the idle power consumption, but at 360 Hz, it does. It's a very odd behavior to see. And when I first saw it, I think it was in Tech Power Up's review of the 7900 XTX. And I was actually surprised as well as curious, and I wanted to check this out. And sure enough, it is exhibiting this behavior on an Asus 360 Hz 1080p panel. So with all those numbers aside, this is the last step I needed to do in order to give you guys a full-fledged review of the RX 7900 XTX, which will be upcoming on the channel very shortly. I wanted to understand the card. I also want to see if there's a driver update in the next few days, say for instance, that does fix a lot of these problems that I've just outlaid in today's video as well as yesterday's video, where we just focused in depth on Warzone and Modern Warfare 2, these titles that do favor the AMD Radeon cards. And in that video, I did point out some other problems that I did come into. However, overall, I think the 7900 XTX is not a bad graphics card, but it's not a great graphics card either. I think AMD definitely overhyped the card in their presentation, and ultimately a lot of those claims have fallen very short, especially when we compare this card to even the RX 6800 XT and those power efficiency claims of up to 54%. I mean, I'm just not seeing it here, especially when I get much better of an undervolt out of the RX 6800 XT. And sure enough, people can say, well, Brian, that's going to get improved in the future. And my response to that would be, that may be the case, but it also could not be the case. Just like the numbers that AMD were promising in the presentation did not come to fruition. And so I don't take these companies' words for anything, whether it's Intel, AMD, or NVIDIA. I just do the tests and then make the recommendations. Now, there's also a possibility that these could be hardware level bugs that just simply won't get ironed out. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, and AMD engineers certainly aren't spilling the beans on any of this information as it's ongoing. And as it stands, this card, if you are in the market for an AMD Radeon card, I think already out on the market, the RX 6000 series cards, whether it's used or new, you're going to get a much better deal than the 7900 XTX, especially not just for the frame per dollar, but also for the power efficiency, especially if you want to undervolt. So although out of the box, this card does do okay, it's just not doing great when we compare it to the current cards already out from AMD, as well as the RTX 4080. That's giving out, in my opinion, a much more polished experience, especially if you're a creator or if you like to undervolt and get the best power efficiency possible. Although it does cost $200 more, ultimately, is that value add going to be worth that $200? And currently, if I was in the market for both the 7900 XTX or the RTX 4080, unfortunately, my eyes would be veering towards the RTX 4080, but actually, I wouldn't be looking at either of these two cards. I'd either be looking at just saving some money, grabbing an RTX 3080, for instance, undervolting that, or going for an RTX 4090. I mean, that's the kind of predicament, just like I said in my RTX 4080 review, where the RTX 4080 was placed, and I feel like the 7900 XTX has just joined the RTX 4080 in that echelon of in a weird spot, but it's looking a little bit worse than the RTX 4080. Though do stay tuned for the full-fledged review, which will be coming out in the next few days, where I'll be testing more games, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, and talking more about the behavior of this graphics card, as well as throwing in things like temperatures and noise levels. And also let us know in the comments section below what you think of today's video, the power consumption test, and the efficiency of the 7900 XTX. Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always. And we've got the question of the day here, which comes from BSong2450, and they ask, I salvaged a Cougar 1050G power supply will it be safe to run with newer hardware? And the answer to that question is, if you run it through a power supply tester, just make sure all the voltage rails are fine, the 12 volt, the 5 volt, and the 3.3 volt, and you should be good to go. I've fixed up many a used power supply, and if they run through the power supply tester, then they're usually good. However, if you're testing it with newer hardware, I'd definitely make sure you run it through the power supply tester, and then I'd run it on a stress test on something else first. I have seen it once before where a power supply did make it through the power supply tester and it was faulty, although it didn't damage any hardware, but there's always that once in a blue moon risk that can occur, and especially if you're coupling that with newer hardware. But if it passes all the green lights on the power supply tester, then it's usually good to go, and hope that answers that question. And with that aside, if you guys have stayed this far and you're enjoying that tech, yes, content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell, and I'll catch you guys in another video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.